I'm Kaveh Madani, a senior fellow at the Yale MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies. Today I'm hosting three colleagues, and we will be focusing on disasters this time. Now I'd like to ask my guests to introduce themselves.
Thanks for the invitation, Kaveh. Amir AghaKouchak, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and also Earth System Science, University of California, Irvine.
Hello, I'm Moftakhari, Assistant Professor at the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering, University of Alabama. Glad to be with you.
Thanks for having me. This is Farshid Vahedifard, an Associate Professor with the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Mississippi State University.
Thanks for accepting my invitation and welcome to this discussion. But before we start, I should clarify why you have been invited. The three of you are engineers, but you have extensively written about disasters in the last few years, have published papers and call for actions on different types of disasters, including floods, fires, and drought. Let me start with Dr. AghaKouchak. Amir, we keep talking about disasters, hazards, crises, and all these terms, extreme events, and we use them interchangeably. So can you clarify the difference?
Sure. When we talk about extreme events, we are talking about rare events like floods and droughts and also even a pandemic that can happen every once in a while. But when we talk about natural disasters, they should have some kind of strong human dimension. Not all natural hazards turn into a disaster. A disaster means loss of life, usually. One of our objectives is to make sure natural hazards don't turn into disasters. Of course, we cannot prevent natural hazards from happening, but with better management and research, we can definitely prevent natural hazards from becoming human disasters.
So any example from Iran or California in recent years?
Last year in spring, there were major floods across Iran, in Golestan, Shiraz, Lorestan, Khuzestan. And as an example, a relatively small-scale flooding in Shiraz turned into human disaster. More than 20 people died. But a more extensive flooding in Khuzestan caused a lot of problems and damages, but it did not turn into a human disaster, at least.
Thank you. Hamed, you have written, if I'm not mistaken, in 2017 about actually disasters, and the example that you have used is a disease outbreak, a small disease outbreak, and you have specifically mentioned Zika, SARS, and Ebola as examples, saying that small outbreaks that are not taken seriously can turn into national disasters. Is what we are seeing today what you were having in mind?
Yeah, basically, when I was writing that paper, we were talking about nuisance floods, which are small-scale floods. But the lessons that we learn about these natural hazards can be applied to a variety of type of disasters and hazards, including COVID-19. Basically, the whole idea over that is when we deal with some hazards like this, which at the beginning, the first community that detected COVID-19 due to the similar symptoms that to flu, they might take it, okay, this is flu, it might go away soon. But if we don't take it serious and don't keep track of the record, it might increase, and we see exponential growth of this virus and then spread. And not only in the first community, but when it enters to Europe, Italy, United States, we see that the process and policy of deferral and incrementalism happening at the beginning. But basically, there is a time that we need to make a decision to go beyond those deferral policies and take action and take like transformative policies into action. So that's the concept that we named it cumulative hazard. which
let me interrupt you here. You also mentioned in the same paper that if policymakers take action too early, they might lose the public trust. And if they act too late, the disaster can turn into something very costly. But how do we know the optimal point of intervention?
That's honestly a great challenge that policymakers and decision makers are dealing with. Basically, we are dealing with a phenomenon which is not well understood, like COVID-19, and let's consider those decision makers that they're gonna put policies into effect, like social distancing, quarantine, or other type of actions that a community can take. But the question here is when to take these into action and when to like pause the financial activities or industries or like other type of activities in the community. And one suggestion here is that obviously there is not a one solution for all, but one suggestion here is to keep track of these type of events. Like when we deal with COVID-19 at the beginning, rather than deferring and ignoring the impacts, even small at the incident level, we should keep track of these events, because if they accumulate over time, they might turn into disasters and have global or national scale impacts.
So keeping track of things is what you're recommending, and now I want to turn to Farshid, who has been calling for creating an integrated data sharing network or platform. Farshid, right after the big wildfire in California, you wrote something in Science calling for such thing. In case of the COVID-19 crisis, could have we done better? What sort of data could we share, or can we still share?
We have very limited experience with pandemics like the current one, but we do have way more experience dealing with natural hazards and extreme events. So I think we can learn from some of those lessons to better deal with something like a pandemic. Of course, it has a much larger scale, but there are some common elements. For example, in the study that you mentioned, we were interested to see the impact of like a wildfire on communities and also infrastructure systems. What we learned from that study was, in all cases, a critical component was timely and properly collecting data, synthesizing data, and disseminating data to general public and also decision makers from different sectors. When there is a case of disaster, there are different sectors involved. They are independent. At the same time, they should work together to have a unified system. We are talking about transportation system, energy system, safety or public health, all those systems that should work together in order to have such an integrated data framework. In that case, I'm going to use it as an example. In the case of wildfire that you mentioned, we learned that a lot of people, they didn't get like a notice in a timely manner, so they didn't have an idea about evacuation plans. So they were burned like roads or highways. We can use those elements to see what we can do with like a pandemic like this. Of course, we don't have such data in place from previous experiences from pandemics because of limited experience that we have with pandemics. But what we can do, we can collect data in as we go and as we learn, and try to synthesize and try to disseminate the data in a timely manner to general public, in order to inform them, in order to educate them to how to respond before getting into a major disaster. I would say if we could collect data and disseminate data in a more timely manner, we wouldn't get the panic mode that we kind of experienced right after general public started getting pretty worried about the whole pandemic issue.
And so one major difference here might be that the pandemic that we are facing right now is not as frequent as the disasters that you're talking about, and as we have seen, it's in terms of scale is much bigger than any other thing we have dealt with, but it's a gradual thing. So we didn't have all countries being hit by the coronavirus at the same time. So I imagine that the countries which faced this problem later on could have used the data from other countries to cope with this better. We are hearing some countries blaming China for not disclosing the enough information, so other countries dismissed how big this problem can be. The Iranian speaker of the health ministry also blamed China for not talking honestly about the scale of the problem, and this even turned into something diplomatic. The Chinese ambassador reacted very strongly to this statement. But one other issue I want to ask is, what sort of information can we share? Dr. AghaKouchak, I remember that when Iran was going through the flood of March 2019, you were worried about some of these instructions or notices or warnings that are being issued. Can you make a comparison between today and what's happening in Iran and what was happening back then?
Sure. In case of Iran's flood back in 2019, spring of 2019, the issue was that there were lots of warnings without clear instruction. For example, people in this neighborhood should evacuate, but it wasn't clear that they should evacuate and go where, which roads are safe, where they need to go. And those sort of warning and disaster management requires planning in advance, way in advance. It's too late probably to develop evacuation plans while an event is happening. So this has to happen as part of the preparedness in advance. All agencies should know what to do when an event like a major flooding is happening, and how the information should be communicated to people, especially if there is failure of infrastructure, communication systems, and what needs to be there in the message, like instructions for people on like evacuation or whatever it is. And this applies to all kinds of hazards and disasters, including pandemics. It doesn't matter. This requires planning in advance. Basically,
so you're dealing with an unprecedented issue, a disaster. How do you plan for it, right? What is the role of memory, for example? In Iran, we saw that a flood which came after a long drought was very destructive because people were not prepared for it, or the system was not prepared for it. You cannot build flood walls overnight. You cannot build hospitals and train doctors and nurses overnight. So what is the role of memory here?
Right. Role of memory has been studied really well in the area of natural hazards. We have the tendency of basically forgetting quickly. If, like in case of Iran, we dealt with many years of below average precipitation and drought, and then 2 years in a row, we have seen above average rainfall and floodings in different places. And people have already forgotten droughts, right? Now we are talking about long-term floods, but these things can change relatively quickly. And we have this tendency of focusing on moving on basically, because there are all kinds of issues, hazards, all kinds of economic issues, societal issues, and we quickly move from one problem to another, and we fail to really look back and take measures to reduce our vulnerability in the long run. This applies to everywhere. It's not unique to Iran, everywhere around the world. Yes, we learn something, we do something about it, but if you think about it, we have this tendency of forgetting and not really taking advantage of what we've learned from previous extreme events. And in case of pandemic, as you said correctly, we don't have a lot of experience in the past, and because of that, we have not been prepared well.
And we are talking about, of course, the recent past. Pandemics have been there for forever, but we are the humans who are planning to go to the moon and are entering the space and so on. So we were, I think, too proud thinking that something like the coronavirus can never be a threat and that we can deal with it properly. But, Hamed, let me ask you about this. You have also talked about, compound disasters and cumulative hazards and things like this. In the case of coronavirus, we keep talking about the coronavirus crisis, but are we missing any dimensions, other things that might come downstream and the things that we are not talking about?
Yeah, so talking about compound events, by definition, these are events that are multiple interrelated hazards happening at the same time or in concurrence. And the impact of one might lead to a sort of higher vulnerability to the upcoming events. One classic example can be if an earthquake happens in an urban setting, a damage to gas pipeline infrastructure leads to a situation ideal for fire hazard. And so the fire departments are usually trained and equipped for controlling fire within their assigned zone. But what happens is this fire happening after an earthquake, which infrastructure is already damaged, and the maneuver and equipment and basically resources already allocated to rescue people who are affected by the earthquake itself. Coming back to COVID-19, we are dealing not only at the national level, at the global level, we are dealing with communities which hospitals are already full, ICU beds are very limited, the health system already overwhelmed. And so the question is that what if in this case, and some sort of natural hazard happens, like in Iran, we have experienced over the past 2 months, multiple floods across the country, number of earthquakes have been reported. And so the question would be how the first responders and emergency responders would be able to take care of the people affected by the follow-up of these hazards, which are actually more vulnerable than the usual cases and regular times, because COVID-19 has already posed lots of pressure on the number of resources that we already have to react during the time of other national hazards. And this is the case that might lead to disasters. Basically, a community is already vulnerable due to the first kind of hazard, and for the follow-up hazards and cascades of hazards, we will experience larger impacts that we do not usually expect from each of these hazards in isolation.
You correctly mentioned, so this can be a multi-stage thing. After the wave of, the health issues, then we had the wave of economic issues, and now we're talking about the impacts on the food sector and poverty. But besides the natural hazards, we might also have the human-made hazards or human hazards, right? Poor management, sanctions, bad economies, recession, and all these things can also reduce your capacity to respond to a threat, and that is what we are seeing. Some countries are not as resilient as others when it comes to responding to this crisis, this big crisis that we are facing right now. So speaking of resilience, Dr. Vahedifard, what can make us more resilient to events like this? We know that crisis is always helpful, and we say that small crises can improve our resilience over time. But what does that mean? How can we improve the resilience of our systems?
That's a great question. First, let's review what we mean by resiliency. I would say there are different definitions for resiliency, but four main components of resiliency are anticipation, preparedness, response, and recovery. As of now, we are kind of like in the response phase of resiliency. So we could do better in anticipation and preparedness, but that's over now. But what we can do better is basically to better prepare for the recovery phase. The post coronavirus state is no longer than the same as pre-coronavirus era. So we should prepare the general public and also all systems that we have to better deal with post-corona virus era. And it means that we have to consider different dimensions. As you know, that when we deal with, I'm going to use natural disasters again as an example. When we deal with natural disasters, in most cases we see a chain of events that are happening. It can be a combination of natural events and a combination of natural events and man-made, issues, as you said, like poor management or some other factor. That's something that I think at this point we need to focus on. We need to we better prepare for post coronavirus era. We need to prepare the general public. We already passed the anticipation, preparedness, and response, and we are in the middle of response phase. But this is the time that we need to focus on the recovery phase. When we reopen the economy, when we reopen the education system, when we reopen like all business that there are going to reopen pretty soon, what will be the impact on the system? We are imposing a new shock to the system. Can we absorb the shock with minimum damage to the system? And what will be the short-term and long-term consequence? You know, even communities, you know, that public, I would say, they will be very different. You know, there are several social dimensions that they fall beyond my expertise. But what I'm saying is, from what we learn from natural disasters, is we have to get ready for post coronavirus era now, and that's the preparedness component of resilience.
This is very important because based on experience, we know that we tend to forget very fast, and you know, once the crisis is over, we don't deal with it much anymore. But then, you know, based on what you have discussed so far, even guessing or estimating the end point of the crisis is not easy, because right now we are focusing so much on inventing a vaccine or medicine to cure the disease. In a few months or in less than a year, we might be able to get rid of the virus itself. But shall we think that the crisis would be over by then? Based on what I'm hearing from you, there can be problems in other sectors. So Dr. AghaKouchak, can you tell us about downstream impacts of this crisis? Anything in your areas of work that you're worried about?
So definitely there will be all kinds of impacts, but related to my work would be potentially changes in food production or delays in planting that may have an impact in crop yield and food availability in at least some parts of the world. I don't expect this to lead to a famine or anything, but who knows, maybe it will. Like in this case, we were not able to really predict how this will this pandemic grow, who knows. But yeah, there will be all kinds of problems downstream, and it may take years to recover from downstream impacts. Food is one, definitely economy. Food is probably more longer term than the immediate economy impact. And also diversion of resources from many different sectors to address the impacts of pandemic. And this divergence could be in different sectors of the economy.
Let me use this example. A lot of people in the environmental community or the media are celebrating the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think the climate change debate and fight would have a better situation after this?
No, not really. I don't think we have any reason to celebrate. Yes, emissions are down, and there are some positive environmental impacts, but this is not a solution, right? This is a virus, it's a temporary issue. It is not the solution that we have been looking for. So I don't think there is any reason for celebration. In fact, as soon as this is over, we go back to the same place. In fact, we may even increase emissions because we want to make up for the losses. So I don't think there is any reason to celebrate.
Plus, I mean, the whole world or the countries which are dealing with poverty, unemployment, and lack of goods and food and other things might not have enough resources to cope with other things. Our attention span is limited. Our resources are limited as well. So from what I gather from your points is that disasters will be with us forever. We tend to forget things very quickly. So, this crisis, like other things, would teach us some lessons that we will forget. But like any other crisis, it can help us improve our systems and address some of the inefficiencies. And, another thing is that we don't think about what we need to do after disasters and after crisis, after every crisis. And I think in this case, we would be different. And as you said, transparency and collection of data and sharing data can make a big difference, and it could have and still can make a big difference in the problem that the whole world is dealing with at the moment. Thank you for participating in this interesting discussion.